Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie. On behalf of Books and Books, Harvard Bookstore, and Politics and Prose, we're so delighted to welcome you to a virtual evening with Rachel Heng and Meng to discuss the new book, The Great Reclamation, published by our friends at Riverhead Books. A bit about our guests. Born and raised in Singapore, Rachel Heng is the author of the novel Suicide Club, translated into 10 languages. Her short fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, Glimmer Train, McSweeney's, and elsewhere. She received her MFA from the Michener Center for Writers and has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, Sewanee Writers Conference, and the National Art Council of Singapore, among others. She is currently an assistant professor of English at Wesleyan University. Moderating tonight's event, Meng is the author of Little Gods, a finalist for both the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award and the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. Her short fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories 2020, Pushcart Prize 45, Best of the Small Presses, and elsewhere. Just a quick reminder, you can post any questions you have below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. We will be answering them at the end. Please order your copy of The Great Reclamation and support independent bookstores. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hello. Can you see me? Hi everyone.
Hello.
Oh, Sophie's gone. Thank you so much for being here today. I wish I could see everyone's faces, but sadly, it would be strange to have 100 faces, tiny faces. But thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for being with us, Meng, to talk about my book. I really appreciate it. So I think
I'm so excited to talk to you about it.
Yeah. So should I start? Maybe I'll start with a quick reading and then we'll go into Q&A. So this is the book, in case you can't see the little ones behind me. It's out. It was out last week. And if you would like to get a copy, I will say it would make me so happy if you got them from Books and Books or Harvard Bookstore or Politics and Prose. Thank you so much to the bookstores for hosting this virtual event. And so I'm just going to read a little bit, a very short bit from the beginning. Decades later, the kampong would trace it all back to this very hour. Waves draining the light from this slim, hungry moon. Decades later, they would wonder what could have been had the leaves simply turned back, had some sickness come upon the father, manning the outboard motor, or some screaming fit befallen the youngest, forcing them to abandon the day's work and steer their small wooden craft home. Decades later, they would wonder if any difference could have been made at all. Or would past still coalesce into present, the uncle dying the way he did, an outcast burned to blackened bone in a house some said was never his anyway. The kampong still destroyed, not swallowed whole by the waves in accordance with some angry god's decree, as the villagers had always feared, but taken to pieces and sold for parts by the inhabitants themselves. If the little boy, the sweetest, most sensitive boy in kampong, would nevertheless have become a man who so easily bent the future to his will. Perhaps he would have. Perhaps this had nothing to do with the hour, the boat, the sea, and everything to do with the boy. But these questions could only be asked after the wars had been fought and the nation born and the sea, once thought of as dependable, eternal, stopped with ton upon ton of sand. These questions would not occur to anyone until the events had fully passed them by, until there was nothing to be done. All were fossils, all was calcified history. For now, though, the year was still 1941, the territory of Singapore still governed by the Angmors as it had been for the past century, and the boy, very little, very afraid, still crouched in the back of his father's fishing boat. Thank you.
Well, I imagine that all the people at home are applauding right now because that's a really beautiful reading. Yeah, and it was so beautiful to hear you read that beginning after reading the whole book because you sort of you can't know this when you read it the first time, but that opening really contains almost the entire book within it in such a sort of lushly, lyrically condensed way. This is such a beautiful book. It's so impressive. It's an epic history. I mean, that it's been described as an epic historical tale, and that those are, I think, the correct words to describe it. Because it tracks Singapore through a period of very turbulent history, um, and looks at all the events sort of head on. And at the same time, it tells a very intimate and personal story. And I feel like you did such a beautiful job of sort of just modulating the intimate with the grand historical, right? We have these characters who are living through this history and sort of moving through the paths that it carves for them, but they're also, um, like any humans, motivated by the people and the forces that are closest to them. So I guess my first question for you is, did all of this like big whole intricate package come to you at one time? Or did you start off thinking like I want to write a story about this period of Singapore's history, or did a character come to you? There are
Mhm.
also some islands, some cool, fancy, fantastical islands in this book. Or did that come to you first? Yeah. So how did this this intricate package come together?
It arrived fully formed, and I wrote it in joking. No, it was definitely not. It was a long and arduous journey, I would say, the writing process. And I think I knew I wanted to write about the time period, very specifically.
Mm,
I wanted to write about the rapid change that happened in those decades, because I think I had grown up in a very particular Singapore, a kind of modern, urbanized Singapore, which is the one you see in the movies, like the Crazy Rich Asians and the
yeah.
Westworld sort of utopian stand-in, and that Singapore is actually relatively new. So, the Singapore I would hear my mom talk about growing up was just very different. Like, she grew up in a wooden shop house. They didn't have running water. They had relatives in much more rural areas where, they would go play in the forest, and, the kids in the book playing with the rubber seats. That's based on my mom's stories about how she would play with her cousins in the forest, because there just was a lot more vegetation and forest land back then, before it was raised to build high rises. So I think there was always this feeling of this other Singapore, this old Singapore that I didn't know that existed not a very long time ago. It was a matter of decades, right? Because it was in my mother's lifetime. And so at the same time, Singapore changes so rapidly that even today, every time I go back, it's different. Because now I live in the US, and
Yeah.
when I go back and I'm like, oh, this road is different, this building is different. And that pace of change, I think, is something that haunts a lot of Singaporean writers and artists, just kind of grappling with what does memory mean, what does childhood mean, what does home mean, when all of these
Yeah.
the physical landscape is literally morphing and transforming around you. And so I think this particular time period was really interesting to me as kind of the genesis of all of that change, all the the massive changes that happened kind of in response to the war, to World War II, and to colonialism, when Singapore finally got
Mhm.
independence from the British, and this will to self-determination, to like build a country, build a future for ourselves, to control our
Yeah.
own destiny. And part of that was this like massive physical transformation of the landscape, along with like the political changes, the social changes. And so I knew, okay, I was going to write about this time period. And then the question was as always, how, right? Like, who are the characters?
Right.
How do I actually approach this massive project, doing all the research. um, and I think I had started a different version that was more of almost like a straight, felt more like a historical reenactment, almost like me trying to write in this textbook voice. And I got really
Mm.
frustrated and bored with it, and then went to a Q&A with Amy Hempel, and I asked her, what do you do if you find yourself really bored by what you're writing? And she was like, and you kind of think like, oh, I just need to power through, right? As a writer, like, don't give up, just keep going. And then she was like, well, if you're bored, your reader's probably going to be really bored, so you should just stop. And I was like, okay, Amy Hempel said I could stop. So I set that aside, and I kind of stopped working on it for a while. And then eventually wrote a short story that is right now one of the chapters in the middle of the book, where Abun, the main character, is a young man, and he's living, he's in his village, and then these government officials, all dressed in white, come in and they start planting little flags in the ground. And it's this moment of that where the future is intruding on the somewhat idyllic life of the villagers. They've been kind of protected from all the change, and now it's entered, their backyard, so to speak. So that became a short story that was about how surreal that must have felt. And there's no sort of magical realism or anything in that story, but the voice is one that approaches the strangeness of the history, and kind of makes reality, I guess, feel stranger than it actually was, because I think so much of what happened in Singapore was already so strange. And once I found that voice, then it was sort of a way into the book and coming back to the islands that you mentioned that we can talk about more. But that sort of opened it for me, unlocked it, and then the book came out from that. I went back 20 years, and then we meet Abun when he's a little boy, and then we get his whole story.
Well, that's so fascinating that your first real entry into it was from the middle of the book. Yeah, I love that. So you mentioned that you did a lot of historical research, and there's this beautiful author's note at least in the at the front of this edition that I have for the reader. I don't know if it's in
I don't
know if it's in okay, but it's beautiful, and it talks about how you learned about Singaporean history while you were in school, basically, and how it affected you. So I guess I'm wondering, as you wrote this story, that is also a story of a nation, were you trying to write against or into any dominant historical narratives that you inherited? And also, as you wrote and researched, what did you learn about either about the history itself or about the way the history is told? And also, what did you learn about the way that you wanted to tell the history?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you for asking it. I think, yes, there definitely was, a narrative that we grew up with in school. Well, there was a lot that we weren't taught, firstly. I think the education system in my time, at least what you learned, was still fairly sort of Eurocentric. So you don't actually learn that much local history. And then the history that you do learn follows a particular narrative. I think every country has its founding myths, right? There's certain myths that are held up as part of the national identity. And I think the one that was very dominant when I grew up in Singapore was this notion of Singapore being an economic miracle, and that being something that had been hard won, that we needed to protect at all costs, right? So, this whole notion of from third world to first in one generation, that we became so, we grew out of this poverty, and we were sort of abandoned almost by the British during World War II, and then after that, this hard-won independence, and then going through all the political turmoil, and out of that managed to sort of wrest a very high quality of living from the jaws of all of that difficulty, with no natural resources to speak of, just being this small island. And so I think that there's certainly a lot of truth to that, right? Because the reality is that quality of life increased massively in one generation, and I benefited from that. But also, I think something that wasn't talked about was kind of the costs of that progress, and everything that got kind of built over by the wayside. It's almost as if, in order to keep moving forward, we don't acknowledge the past, or we don't acknowledge the cost, or acknowledge, it's this sort of straightforward, unqualified good, that progress is an unqualified good. I think that was the narrative. And so in reading the research and in going back, to kind of understand more about this time in order to write this book, I think there was, I read a lot of oral history interviews, and I found a lot of them very moving, because they're these older Singaporeans, and Singaporeans are known to be quite a pragmatic people, quite unsentimental and quite sort of more focused, not really emotionally expressive, or not really idealistic, more kind of okay, we're going to do what needs to be done, and that's that. And so it was really moving to read these interviews of older Singaporeans who were talking about their homes and just talking about the places that had changed. I remember there was an interview of one guy who lived by the coast, and he was talking about all the dust, right, from the land reclamation, all the dust from the building, and how the place where he used to walk, there were all these crabs. There used to be crabs that would just come up from the little holes in the shore, and there were no more crabs. And this tenderness for landscape and this tenderness for home that I think I didn't really grow up with, that connection to the physical environment. And there was frankly quite a lot of grief that I encountered in those interviews. And it felt like often there wasn't really a space for that, or there wasn't really, it wasn't something that you really saw in the dominant historical narratives, at least when I was growing up. Certainly it might have changed now. And I think, there is more room for those conversations. And so that was a big thing that I found in my research, that I guess I worried as a writer that I was imposing certain notions of like nostalgia, and it's always easy to be in the present and say, oh, the past, it must have been sad to lose that. But then when you go back and you actually read the history, you're like, oh no, people were sad. Like, thankfully that is a universal feeling, that grief at loss of one's home. And so I think in doing the research, it did feel like something that not just was important for the book, but important for me as a person and as a Singaporean to kind of understand the trajectory and the path of Singaporean history that I wasn't necessarily taught in school.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that you do so beautifully in the book is that you have a cast of characters that you really care about, and each of them responds a little differently, right, to that sense of grief, to the loss, or to the changes that are happening as people do in life. So I feel like there's room in the story that you're telling for both. It's kind of remarkable how there's room in the story that you're telling for both that narrative of progress, and for the narrative of loss and grief. So we mentioned a little briefly, and I don't want to give too much away, but I don't think it's giving too much away to say that there are some semi-magical islands in the book, and that their appearance is crucial to the book. Abun, the the protagonist, discovers them with his father while they're fishing as a child, and they sort of appear sometimes and don't appear sometimes, but it's a kind of discovery that almost feels like an invention of land, right? That echoes really hauntingly with the enforced invention of land that happens later with the Great Reclamation. So I guess I'm really interested in like the way that you conceived of this, of Abun's world, and like seeing the boundaries of his village sort of expanding one way through this like semi-magical, realist, intuitive, irrational kind of discovery, and the other way through this this narrative of progress, right, of rational, ordered urban planning, and like the sort of what you mentioned earlier, that like will, like self-determination. I guess this is kind of a hard question, but so like all the characters feel sort of differently about this tension, right, which is related to loss versus progress. And I guess I wonder, like, after writing this book, how do you feel about it? Where do you land? And how do you sort of resolve or confront these tensions in your own thinking about your relationship to Singapore and its narrative of itself?
Yeah, firstly, I love the way that you framed that, like the islands versus the, the land of the islands appearing and disappearing, and then the land of the land reclamation appearing out of thin air. And that's exactly what I wanted to write. So thank you for talking about it that way. I do think, the people have asked me like, oh, there are magical islands in the book. Like, why did you do that? And I also like that you said semi-magical, because I guess I didn't think of them as being like magical. I thought of them as being unreliable or unknowable, that there was something outside the scope of human control, because so much of the book is about human beings trying to control, right? Trying to control the environment, trying to control their lives, like trying to control the people around them. And I wanted there in the beginning to be something that was fully unknowable and fully outside of the character's control. And then they encounter that mystery. And then the question is, what do they do with it, right? And yeah, I guess I shouldn't say more because that will be spoiling it. So on the question of what I came out feeling after writing this, I think that I don't have an answer still. I think it's something I might wrestle with for the rest of my life, maybe. And I do think that, people sometimes ask, like, what do you want readers to take away? Or like, what is the message of the novel? And I really believe that novels don't have messages or answers, that they are at best a very clearly articulated set of questions, and that you write them because you have a certain irreconcilable question that you're like, I just, something that nags at you and that haunts you. And then the only way to articulate that is to tell it in the form of a story. And, as you mentioned, there are many characters with competing points of view, right? Some people are for the progress, some people are against it. And you can kind of see everybody's point of view, because I think I can sort of see everybody's point of view. I can't help but empathize with them, perhaps because these are all people that I, in a way, grew up with, that, this is my community. These are the people that I knew so intimately growing up, that you can't just condemn one point of view. And so I think a novel is a beautiful thing because it allows all of those contradictions and all of those, differing opinions to be held in one place, and for the reader to make up their own mind, or not make up their mind, or to be held in that place of contradiction forever. So I think I still don't have an answer.
I love that, to be held in the place of contradiction forever. I do also believe that is what good novels do to their readers.
Like, if I had an answer, I feel I would be a journalist, or I would write articles or be a politician.
Right. You would have a policy solution.
Yeah.
You would be like one of the characters in the book
exactly.
who joins one movement or another.
I have a soft spot for Uncle, who is this, for the people who haven't read the book, it's this older character who everyone thinks is very irrational because he refuses to go along with everything, and everyone's like, what's your problem, man? Just like, get with the program. And he just is so attached to, the past and his way of life, just because I think like there were people like that in Singapore, and they are the ones whom you most do not hear from, that they were just left by the wayside. And so there's a part of me that's always going to be kind of a little bit on Uncle's side.
Yeah, I mean, I love Uncle too, and I remember this like kind of brutal moment when Uncle and Abun have this fight, and Abun says like, what can I do? Like, he doesn't understand what the world is now. And I was like, oh yes, I can see how I've like seen like people in my family talk about older generations in that way. But also the reason why I identify with him so much is because, I don't understand what the world is now. And that's why I write, like that place of not understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you were...
And he doesn't, just because he doesn't agree with the world doesn't make him the wrong one, even though he feels that way, right? He's like, am I going crazy? Like, how is it everyone just like agrees on this, and I just don't, like, don't you guys see what's happening? And that loneliness of being like the only dissenting voice. I think there's something so like poignant and powerful in that.
Yeah. I mean, when you were talking about the sort of like pace of modernization, I identified with that so much because, a city that I'm interested in is Shanghai, which is in the last, in my lifetime seen that same pace of modernization that feels like hallucinatory and
Yeah.
um, and when you're and not Abu, an uncle reminds me of like, you know, one of the nail houses, you know, in
Mm,
the urbanization campaigns. There's the stubborn people who just won't get with the program.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's like
Yeah.
this inexorable force that's bearing down on you, and somehow they're just like, they're just standing their ground. And that also they also had land reclamation, right, as part of that. I think also happened.
Right. I guess while we were talking, I was thinking about how, I mean, you said, like, talked about the human costs of progress, right? And of modernization. And one thing that really sort of was clarified for me in this book and the way you wrote the semi-magical islands is that maybe one of like the biggest human costs is like enchantment and mystery, right? That when you have a future that's so planned and ordered and rational that the cost of it is that you lose things that you can't explain,
Mhm.
that don't fit into that order. And so I guess along those lines, I was wondering if like this idea of disenchantment was with you from the beginning of your writing process, and also um, how you drew the boundaries of that semi-magical place, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you ever were tempted to like make it a more magical realist novel, or
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah. It actually, I did not even plan for there to be those islands in the book. They kind of
Oh.
just came up as I was writing it. But the way you just talked about it, that the cost is like enchantment and mystery and the unknowable. I think that's something I'm always interested in because I grew up in Singapore. I grew up within that system. In many ways, I was a product of that system for many years. Like I did the exams and I got the scholarship and I worked for the government and I did all the stuff. My worldview was very much shaped by that perspective. But always feeling something being, slightly, and I think writing helped me figure out what it was that felt in a way wrong about it, which was the loss of the mystery or the contradictory or, spaces for just like the unknowable in life. And that's a very difficult thing to argue for in the face of kind of a
Yeah.
democratic, rational person. I don't know if you may have experienced this in life talking to certain types of people, but it's very hard to argue for irrationality in a highly rational place. And I think that's what I wanted to get at in this book, that the beauty of the unknowable or the beauty of the irrational, that which cannot be quantified or measured or made use of, right? That doesn't have any like utilitarian value. So I think that came very intuitively as I was writing to have the islands come out almost as characters of their own, almost like, before the land gets disciplined and corralled into this organized space, for the land to like have its own voice. I think it felt like a
Mm.
natural, yeah, natural evolution of the story as I was writing it.
I love that. I love thinking of those islands as the land having their own voice. That's so beautiful.
Thank you.
The other thing that I thought about while I was reading, that reminded me of sort of, you know, the way that I think of China's modernization, is how the Gamen, who are the Singaporean government, right, that takes over after the colonizers are kicked out, um,
Mhm.
that their attitude is sort of one of um, like we can do what you're doing better than you. Like
Mhm.
you think that you can, you know, you think you can, you're modern, you think you have technology, you think you can do urban planning. Well, we can do that even better than you. And it felt like it feels like such like a response that like that governments in the East have
Yeah.
had, I guess, to Western colonization. It feels to me like a trauma response almost. And I read in it and felt in it sort of like parallels to like debates about and conversations about like white adjacency in Asian American discourses. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, since you grew up in Singapore, but you live in the US now, um, if if did you think about that parallel at all? And how does it maybe like how does it feel different to be a post-colonial subject in Singapore versus the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't know that I thought about it in relation to the US, because it did feel to me like a very I'm sure there are parallels, but I didn't. To me, it felt like when I was writing this, I was very much writing as a Singaporean for a Singaporean audience and kind of working out something that had been with me my whole life and that I hoped would speak to people who had kind of been through the same thing. And I'm very glad that it has resonated with a much wider audience. But I think certainly there are parallels just because we live in a world that is shaped by colonialism and imperialism and all these forces and now capitalism, right? And so I think to that point about the trauma response of kind of exploiting the natural environment or extracting more or being more economically powerful than the colonializing forces. That is shaped by the exigencies of the world that people find themselves in, right? Possibly the same as how Asian Americans react in America. It's like you find yourself within this environment, and often to survive, you do what allows you to survive. And so I think that is probably the closest parallel to it. That people, just because they have managed to escape from, or managed to throw off the mantle of colonization, doesn't mean that they are suddenly in a new world. They're still in the old world, right? Shaped by all these global forces. They're still subject to having to I don't know, trade with other countries. They're still dealing with questions of like poverty and like quality of living and the fact that, they've been impoverished for so many years and like dealing with like what to do with that after. And so I think it is, in a way, as long as we are within those systems and those systems still exist, there is no escaping them. It is inextricable, right? Both in the US and in Singapore and in so many parts of the world.
Yeah.
Not to be too.
Yeah. So another interesting tension that I felt, maybe another sort of like, what was that wonderful phrase you said? Like this contradiction that you will just hold the reader in, that I felt while reading this, was a sort of tension between people who want to change or like revolutionize the world or like their world. And in particular, I'm thinking about characters. I'm probably going to butcher her name, but Seok Mei.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, who is a communist, right? She's sort of adds another type of another lens, or like another lens for thinking about progress and modernity to the story. Um, I felt this tension between like her desire to change the conditions of their lives with the people who were sort of caught up in the actual daily conditions of those lives, people like Abun, and that tension you like beautifully put into a romantic tension as well. That Seok Mei is like making decisions based on causes, and Abun wants her to make decisions based on like people and daily life, like the things that are right in front of her face rather than the ideologies that are far away from her. I guess I that's an observation. What's my question? Maybe you could just talk a little bit about why that narrative was important to you, and how that character came into the story.
Yeah, totally. I think that what I wanted to write about was the ways in which politics are so deeply personal, that we think of them as these like intellectual things that we come to, beliefs that we come to, again, the rational versus the irrational, right? Or the conscious versus the unconscious. That we think that we have all these like rational opinions on why we believe the things we do, but that we're so shaped by our environment and by our families, by the people we love. And often, those beliefs are shaped by the personal circumstances of one's life. And even Seok Mei, who is so principled and so fiery and so ideologically driven, is that way because her parents were that way, right? So her parents were revolutionaries, left her and her siblings in order to go back to China to fight against the Japanese. So that is the central belief of her life, that she must devote her life to politics as her parents did. Because if she doesn't do that, then in a way she's accepting that they left her for a less than adequate reason, right? And that's too painful for her to bear. So much of her political belief and her passion for that comes out of the personal. It comes out of love and loss and grief, just as Abun's does as well, that he's much more concerned with the immediate well-being of his family because he's seen, what that lack of power or that lack of resources can do, right? Not to, again, give away too many spoilers, but he's shaped by what happens to him. So I think they're both in a way responding to the personal, and they're just responding to the cards that life has dealt them in a way, and are both motivated very much by love and where they find comfort and safety. But just it manifests itself in different ways. And I think, yeah, as you beautifully put it, that then that manifests itself in that love story between them, and the ways in which they are constantly pulled apart by these differing beliefs, but also eventually always come back together because of that very deep, personal, intimate connection. And I think in a way it has to do with the coming of age aspect of the story, because I wanted it to be a coming of age story for Abun, but also sort of a coming of age story for Singapore, because it is the years leading up to independence. And to me, a coming of age is not about an individual coming of age, but an individual figuring out who he is in relation to a society, the people around him or her. And so that relationship between Abun and Seok Mei is instrumental for both of them, right? Because they both have to make choices. They're both figuring out who they are and who they want to be in the world and what they're willing to give up and what they're not. And that can only happen through their relationship and their relationship to each other, as well as the people around them. So it was very important for me to write it that way.
I love what you said about coming of age stories as coming of age, not just within oneself, but sort of within a certain environment. I thought that was so beautifully done. I guess so. I want to leave some time for audience questions. So I'll just ask like one, maybe two more questions, and then oh, sorry about that. I was just gonna prompt people to put questions into the ask.
It's completely okay.
About it.
Completely okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
we will be doing the Q&A in a bit. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so Q&A coming up. There's a little button called Ask a Question. So ask your question while I'm asking my final question. Yeah, so I mean, I could ask you a dozen more questions, but I guess this is sort of like a crafty question to end on. The English language is actually also an important sort of point of tension in the story, because as these characters come of age, they develop different relationships to the English language, and it becomes a sort of marker of like where you stand in relation to the progress that's happening. And I mean, I guess knowing that and feeling that, how, and also since you're a writer writing in English, like what, this is kind of a hazily phrased question, but I guess like when you're writing the actual sentences in the English language and you're writing this book in English, how does your sort of questioning about the politics of that, and how it's sort of influencing the story in particular, does that get into your how does that affect the choices you make as a writer, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, the characters are often speaking Singlish in the story whenever you have dialogue. And for those who are less familiar with it, that's I guess, Creole patois that the version of English we speak in Singapore is quite different from like regular English, as people who have been to Singapore might be able to attest. Or when I first came to the US and no one understood what I was saying, but I think often that's a stand-in because the characters wouldn't have been speaking Singlish at the time. They would have been speaking, dialect like either Hokkien or Cantonese or Malay or they wouldn't be speaking any form of English at all. If between the different racial groups people were speaking, the common language was probably Bahasa rather than English, except for amongst the educated classes, which were not many. So in a way, it's the Singlish is the stand-in for all the other languages. And then as Abun progresses and as he goes to school and he becomes more educated, and then he starts to speak English, right? And for him, that's an important thing because in the beginning, he can't speak English. And his boss speaks English, and then she says, oh, you have to go to night classes to learn it. And he's conflicted about it, right? Because of what it represents within the community. And this was a very real thing. The people in my mother's generation had to decide whether to send their kids to Chinese language schools or English language schools in Singapore, because there was this divide. And similarly amongst other racial groups, whether to go to what they call the vernacular or the mother tongue schools versus the English schools. And if you went to English schools, then you would get a better job. That was the reality of it, because there were better jobs available to people who could speak English because of colonization. But at the same time, you were making the choice to, relinquish your mother tongue and your language and your heritage and your culture, and for your child to, in a way, be divided, to be split from you. And just in my family, my grandparents had to make that decision. And my grandmother was a very ambitious woman who wanted, both of them were very poor, and she wanted a better life for her kids. So she wanted them to go to English school, but my grandfather refused. And so they made a compromise and they alternated. They had one child go to English school and the next one go to Chinese school, and the next one go to English school and then Chinese school. And in a way, you do see this split within the family, and the ways in which that you are shaped by that education, and the places that you can go in society based on that language. So it is an extremely fraught decision, I would say. And just the fact that, as you say, I speak English, right? I grew up speaking English. That was my first language. My grandmother doesn't even speak Mandarin, really. She only spoke Hokkien, and I couldn't communicate with her because I never learned dialect. And in schools, we didn't learn dialect either. The Singapore government made a decision to essentially phase out all dialect, all programming, all like TV, radio programming of anything in dialect, and to make the decision that only Mandarin would be taught as like a Chinese language, which is, again, a choice, right? And so I think language does have all of these. I think in Singapore, it's so, in a way, strange because we never left. Like, we were all in the same place. But it is almost parallel to the immigrant experience in the US when I hear people talk about it, right? Being cut off from your past, cut off from your language. But none of that happened. It's like, we all stayed and we grew up in the same place, but the divide between the generations can be so strong because of the way, the government shaped the language policy. And so, to bring it back to the book, I think it's difficult to capture in a novel that is written in one language. And so the way I tried to do that was with Singlish, but also to mark where relevant whenever characters were changing language, because it felt significant to the context that whenever they switched language, it meant that there was a shift in some kind of power dynamic or some kind of class connotation, to mark those moments whenever the characters did transition. And then, of course, for Abun as the main character, for him to learn English through the novel, and by the end to be actually like speaking English quite well. That's part of his, coming of age, and that's part of the choices that he makes, the person that he ends up becoming.
Thank you so much for talking about that.
Thank you.
All right, so audience questions.
Sorry about going on a little bit too early. But okay, now we're back. We're going to move on to the Q&A portion of this event. We do have quite a few questions. If anybody has any more questions that they'd like to add, now is your time to do so. First question. Okay, I know you just kind of spoke about this, but we have a question saying, Malaysian here, love hearing the touches of Singlish vocabulary throughout that quick reading. How did you decide how much to use Singlish in the novel?
Yeah, so it is, there's actually much more than in that beginning. That beginning doesn't even have that much Singlish, but it has some Hokkien. So the way that the British are referred to as like Angmo. And then in dialogue, many of the characters actually speak in Singlish, but mostly through the narration, there is no Singlish. There's just words like words that you would use locally, I guess. And then, as I mentioned earlier, not to be repetitive, then that the dialogue shifts through the book depending on the context of the characters and depending on what they decide to do later on.
Right, thank you. And then so now for the next question we have, hi Rachel, how was your experience of writing The Great Reclamation different from writing your debut, Suicide Club? How have you changed as a writer, if you have? Were there any craft aspects that you felt you were better at or more interested in this time around? P.S. Meng, your bangs look great.
I see that's from Rachel Kong. Thank you, Rachel. Hello.
Hi, Rachel.
Fellow Malaysian author. Yeah, it was very different, I would say. But I wrote my first book while working. I was working in a corporate job, and I never taken a writing class before, and I was like writing it on my own and sort of waking up in the morning and doing the thing. And so it was very much, my first book was written so much in isolation. And, one of the first people to see it was the agent that I ended up signing with, and then my editor. And I didn't know other writers at that point. And then I wrote this book after going to an MFA program. So I had much more community, much more support, mentors, and also much more time because I was in a wonderfully fully funded program that didn't require teaching. So I just had 3 years to really like do the research, think about it right. And so I guess it was a very different writing process. It took me longer still, even though I had more time than the first book. The first book I wrote more quickly. I think because with the first book, it's sort of like you don't know what you don't know. And maybe other writers can relate to this as well. So you just like dive in and you just keep going. Whereas I felt like with this book, I questioned myself so much more. And I struggle, I kind of would try to be like, should I do it like this or like that or like this or like that, and I would really overthink every single decision. And at the end of the day, I just had to write it anyway and then see what worked and what didn't work and then do the usual painful revision. I think that was probably the biggest thing I learned after writing this book, which is there is no avoiding the big painful revision and the feeling of like being at sea and completely not knowing what you're doing, especially in a book that spans 20 years and deals with all of this history. So I think in a way it was more painful and less painful to write this book, if that answers the question.
That's very interesting. I never thought about it that way. I'm sure a lot of writers relate to that. We have another one. Hi, Rachel. I read your short story, The Remembers, last year for a creative writing class before the advent of ChatGPT. I'm wondering what inspired the specific elements of the story, like AI. How do you balance world building with character development?
Oh, wow. First, thank you for that question, and thank you for reading that story. For those who don't know it, it's a short story that I wrote in tandem with an NRDC expert, and it was commissioned by McSweeney's as part of a special climate issue in response to the UN climate report. So there was a lot of information, but essentially it's a slightly speculative story set in a near future Singapore dealing with rising sea levels. And so the question about world building versus character, I think the way I think about it is that they aren't really separate things. And that even if you're writing a so-called, realist story set in the real world, you are still world building. Like you still have to build the world. It's just that there are different things that you're building, right? And there is no like neutral world. I don't know, unless you're like a I don't know, a white writer writing about New York City or something. You know, maybe that's like you can take certain things for granted or something. But I do think no matter what setting you are writing in, you still have to do the world building. That's what I always tell my students, at least. Whether it's like sci-fi speculative, or if it's like real, or if it's domestic, or it's like, you know, I don't know, whatever it is, or if it's the internal landscape that you are building. And so in that way, I don't think of it as being separate from character, because the character exists in relation to the world. And as I was saying earlier about the coming of age and the society, I never think of individuals in vacuums. They only exist in relation to what is around them. And so the world gets built at the same time as the character gets built when I am writing a story. I don't think I think of it as like, oh, this is the world, now I need a character to populate it. It's more that the character arises naturally or arises organically out of the world, and vice versa. The world is shaped by those characters, if that makes sense. And then in sci-fi, maybe in the more speculative work, it's a little different. And in particular, in that story, because it's a short story, I think often the character is related to the central question of the world. So that world was one in which Singapore is dealing with rising sea levels, and basically the government comes up with an artificial intelligence project to harness the memories of older generations of Singaporeans, to run it through this giant algorithm to come up with a solution for climate change. That was the premise of the story. And because it was about that, so the character that arose naturally out of that was an older Singaporean who had this fraught relationship with memory. So again, the character arising naturally out of the world, and vice versa.
Thank you. I think those are all the questions that we have for tonight. Rachel, Meng, thank you both so much for doing this. I'm sure on behalf of Books and Books, Harvard Bookstore, and Politics and Prose, we really appreciate it. This was a lovely discussion, and I want to thank the audience for joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Meng. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, all the bookstores. Thank you for tuning in.
Yes. And everyone, please buy this book. So I will be ending the broadcast now, but thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good